pentiment. You can kind of see a little bit more of the activity in the park. To be truthful, it was a little daunting working independently in the park and just with a group of basically kids. There are a lot of different people in the park, and there are some people here who seem to be wanting to truly be left alone, not even to be looked at. But there were never, of course, any problems. My experience in working in public places is one's imagination outstrips any kind of possibility of danger for the most part, as long as you're treating people with respect. We were in the park constantly over this period. Part of the design of the entire project, of course, I was aware of, was that it would change in terms of its meaning and also visual value over the course of Minnesota's long seasonal shifts. I was very much looking forward to this part of the process, in part because I had been really inspired in the back of my mind by having been a guard and having looked out the window at this park. There are several large windows in the museum facing out, and I was doing it in February or March, sometime in the early 90s as a guard. I just was looking for any glimmer of hope during the Minnesota winter. And adding a little color is just a little contribution. This is a Lakota cradle that then kind of plays out here in a new way. Marshall Gorky. And of course, as somebody who's very keen and about photography and thinking about photography, it also doesn't necessarily become a strategy to create photographs per se. I'm not sure that these are really destined or most appropriately shared in the idea of a print in a frame on a museum wall or a gallery wall or a personal wall. But they are, they do become interesting in terms of their relationships overall. The meaning of photographs is defined by the next photograph that follows them. And in this case, the seasons help motivate that as well. Back here at George Washington. Again, seeing, at least for me, a personal victory, a realization of what had been a motive for the piece. Offering this to passersby in the park, but also people who were like myself, or are like myself, in the museum, looking out. Hmong migration, right there on the left. And I saw a towel painting in the collection. Again, trying to speak not just to the kind of classics, the kind of iconic images from the museum's collection, but to draw on the diversity, the cultural diversity that an encyclopedic museum naturally has. Oftentimes, not the case with contemporary practice, or contemporary museums. And power trees. And as the documentation process has gone on, especially in the winter, you realize, wow, the trees really get interesting. It becomes somehow, it highlights, and the benches allow a kind of different way to think about the actual ecosystem of the park itself. So this piece here in the foreground is drawn from the Grand Salon in Paris. Had to add that gold in there so no one would mistake it for a Target advertisement. Minneapolis, that's pretty tough. And then, of course, spring comes again. So there is some relief, and the context changes even again from that summer kind of light and summer green to the Minneapolis green of spring. A lot of different uses, and the park is alive again in a lot of ways. That's the Mondrian in the foreground there on the left. Kind of gets to play between the colors of the benches, which I, for the best of me, couldn't necessarily engineer in the design process, but I do think is happening on some slight level. Spring in Minneapolis, just like spring in Madison. Time to death of Germanicus, registering in this moment. And one of the well-known pieces from the museum collection, Frank, which plays down on the left. And of all of the concerns, of course, one of the concerns that was voiced by the museum and the park board, of course, was that these were going to be targets for graffiti, that they were going to be sabotaged, and that this was a reason not to do something like this. Of all of the benches, only 2 have been victimized in any way by human elements. One was crushed by a tree. We'll see that later. But someone stole the name plaque off of the Frank piece, which is a kind of a well-known piece in the collection, which is on the right hand there. And then someone did tag one of the benches. But for the most part, in the great codes of the street art world, they've been left alone. And even people in the park who didn't necessarily have any relation to the museum, and especially a lot of the East African immigrants who are in the park, really were hardly approved of this addition of color to the Minnesota landscape, even on an architectural level. So I felt that was a big success too. Biederman, Charles Biederman, one of Minnesota's great unsung modernists, piece here, a relief sculpture made in the 50s. And then, I've only been over there a handful of times to make documentary photographs, and these things do occur too. One couldn't ever really put together this coincidence palette. I have no idea how or why. This is the bench that even despite the fact that it had been crushed by a fallen tree, seemed to be the one, in a slightly forlorn way, that this guy was attracted to. And one doesn't think that he dressed for the occasion, but somehow it all sinks together. And that's actually a piece that is a photograph of Brancusi's studio by Edward Steichen was the basis for that picture. So somehow these things that are out in the world do coalesce into meaning really in a much different way than the object that we might make in the studio that goes into an institution or a collector's home or a personal situation. These things happen, and they're available free of charge all the time for anybody who wants to see them, who wants to spend time. So, speaking of time, okay, as promised, the second portion of the presentation, departing from what I've been working on in terms of public projects like the park, and even in a way, trying to reach beyond the site specificity to some extent. Starting in the late 1990s, I became very interested in the phenomena of the anagram. I'm sure most of you have heard about the anagram or understand how it operates. A single word, in this case, hustling, whose constituent letters can be reorganized to create another word. Entirely an accident of fate, one would think. As an artist who's interested in chance operations, but also in phenomena and events in the world, trying to parse when accidents have meaning and when they don't is one of the things that I'm particularly interested in. And for whatever reason, I've returned continuously to thinking about anagrams, and at this point I've refined a set of them, 60, that I can identify. Not compound either, and not proper names. Those are some of the kind of common uses of anagrams. These are actually words that, for whatever reason, can be reorganized into another one that, for some reason, I find to be paradoxical or fascinating. In this case, this piece was presented in the lobby of the Minneapolis College of Art and Design as part of the McKnight grant show in 2011. And it was a large, 16 by 8 photographic print, basically, an inkjet print mounted on the board, 2 separate prints mounted together. And of all of the anagrams, this one perhaps is, to me, one of the most peculiar and interesting. Sunlight being what it is, and hustling being what it is as well, with peculiar relationship. Now, as I mentioned, I've refined 60 of these over the course of the years, and I'm still not quite sure how they're going to be elaborated in the world. I've presented them in talks once before, and I've shared them with friends. I've made prints, I have mock-ups for books. I have a little time-based kind of pilot that we'll see at the end. But as we go through these, I just offer these for your consideration. In this case, I find truly that the letters are a kind of trestle that move meaning forward in the process. The relationship between being attracted and being somehow dominated also seems to be resonant to me. This is a very simple thing, but I like the relation. I like the idea that signifying and singing, that there's somehow, and some of these have some linguistic kind of past that share, but because of their kind of organization, they have very different meanings. I found this one kind of encouraging. I used this one originally in a poster that I made in the wake of 9/11 when I was living in New York. And the question is, can you be both at the same time? A few of these are well known outside of my interest in them. Italo Calvino has utilized this particular title for a work of his. In this context, I'm not sure exactly how this fits, but it's a phenomenon of language that we can reorganize these letters. These letters start to have agency, and we start to hopefully, in reflecting on these, see that they're conventions in and of themselves. This whole system of written language has been generated over thousands and thousands of years, and there are these little cracks that hopefully let new thought or new regard slip in. Now, I hope this doesn't affect any of my relationships with current students per se. I'm not sure that any of these are true in direct relation, but there's something I find very peculiar about it. And you should always consider me in this category, actually, in the studio, or anybody in your studio. Again, it seems like it could be related, but it's accidental. And the turns of phrase, the availability of language and metaphor to be redeployed after a discovery like this. I'm not sure what a sunlit insult is, but I could kind of guess it. What an Aristotelian retaliation is, however, it takes a lot more consideration. As does a colonialist oscillation. Now, it's hard to believe that this many letters can be reorganized in this particular way and still have some kind of link. I mean, these are true in that they're reorganized from elements of the other. Whether or not the original meanings attached have value is harder to say. And I like the idea that these things can be somehow explored and understood as nonsensical, which it's perfectly fine for poetry to be, or as portent of real meaning. I mean, I think maybe perhaps some of these characters who are emerging here you're familiar with somehow, or imagine that you're familiar with. What is a dishonest humanist? What is desiring ringside? What is that need to be close? Truth be told, I've used this as a conciliatory way with certain friends in difficult situations. I mean, of course, there's some relation there, but not necessarily happy. These are not also